This is chapter 19, respiratory system. The respiratory system consists of passageways that filter incoming air and transports it into the body, into the lungs, and then there's many microscopic air sacs where the gases will exchange. Respiration, by definition, is the process of exchanging gases between the atmosphere and the body cells. There are a number of types of respiration. We have ventilation. These are the events that will happen with respiration. We have ventilation, which is bringing the air in. External respiration, transport of gases between the lungs and body cells, and then also internal respiration and cellular respiration. Here is your respiratory system. And we think of the respiratory system as structures that bring air into the lungs, but there's also a macroscopic and microscopic level. And gas exchange is primarily between oxygen and carbon dioxide, and that happens at a molecular and cellular level. Aerobic reactions of cellular respiration use oxygen to make ATP. It allows the cells to produce energy from bonds in nutrient molecules. So it will also generate carbon dioxide as waste. So usually carbon dioxide plus water makes carbonic acid, which is very important in your body to maintain your blood pH. The respiratory system provides oxygen for aerobic reactions and eliminates carbon dioxide at appropriate rates to maintain internal environment pH. So here's just a brief picture of cellular respiration. This is not a topic we discussed back in chapter 4, but you should know just some basics of it. The cell will take in glucose and oxygen, and it will convert it in the mitochondria to basically energy, and then it will release carbon dioxide, water, heat, and some acid as its waste. The organs of our respiratory system are divided into two tracts. We have the upper respiratory and the lower respiratory tract. The upper is basically the head, so nose, nasal cavity, sinuses, pharynx. Lower is going to be from the voice box down, so larynx, trachea, bronchial tree, and lungs. Here is some imaging of our upper respiratory tract. And then lower is just an x-ray showing you the lung field, which is all black here because it's so thin. Radiation goes through it, makes it darker on the film. Bone is denser, thus why it's white. And muscle's denser too, so you can see the diaphragm across down here. The nose consists of the nostrils or external nares. They are providing the opening for air to enter and leave the nasal cavity. They are protected by internal hairs to catch any kind of pollen or any kind of allergens that are in the air. Your nose is divided into two halves, and it's divided by the nasal septum, which is coming from the vomer and a perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, as well as some cartilage towards the front. The nasal cavity is a hollow space behind the nose. It's separated into the left and right portions by the nasal septum. So that's in the middle, but on the outsides kind of that cavity is, well, it's not outside, but it's on the outer wall of the nasal cavity is the nasal concha. They are these curls of tissue that curl over bones called turbinate bones, and they're on the lateral walls of the cavity. They separate the nasal cavity into passageways called meatuses. Just know that the nasal concha, that's probably enough. I'll show you an image soon. In this concha is olfactory receptors for smelling, and they're lined with mucous membranes, which is, if you recall, pseudostratified ciliated epithelium. And the function of them is to warm air and moisten it and filter it as it enters the body. That nasal cavity tissue has not only that pseudostratified epithelium, but we have a lot of goblet cells, which makes sense because it's producing mucus. This is here to help trap any kind of microorganisms and particles that have been inhaled. The cilia will sweep that mucus towards the pharynx. Then those will be swallowed and destroyed in the stomach acid. Here's some more images if you don't remember what that epithelial looks like with its goblet cells. I guess I don't have any images of the concha. Let me go backwards a second and see if... Here we go. Here, see these like folds and ridges in the nasal cavity? These are the nasal concha. There's 3 of them, a superior, middle, and inferior. Just know that these are the concha and that they're there to partially trap pathogens, but also, more importantly, to warm, moisten the air before it comes into our lungs. Sinuses are also part of your respiratory system, and these are basically air-filled sacs in the skull bones. We have them in the maxillary, the frontal, the ethmoid, the sphenoid bones. And the purpose of sinuses are 2 things. One, it reduces the weight of your skull. So your skull isn't like 20 pounds. It also helps resonate your voice so that it is resonated, which means to kind of like vibrate the sound waves for your voice. If you've ever had congestion in your sinuses, you feel like your voice sounds different to you because of that lack of resonation. So you've probably experienced the difference in the sound of your own voice when those are congested. The cavities themselves have mucous membrane lined in them as well. Here's pictures of the sinuses. I think most general public thinks of the sinus as just kind of behind the nose or in the cheeks, but as you can see here, they're kind of throughout that frontal part of the skull. The pharynx. Remember, pharynx is going to be that posterior region behind the mouth and the nasal cavity. This is a passageway for food and air, and it aids in sound production. There's 3 portions of the pharynx, which we've talked about before. We have the nasopharynx behind the nose, the oral pharynx behind the mouth, and the laryngopharynx by the larynx. Here it is outlined in blue. The pharynx is the whole thing up at the top, the nasopharynx up behind the nose, oral behind the mouth, and laryngeal behind the larynx. So the larynx itself is this enlargement in the air superior to the trachea. It moves air in and out of the trachea. Your vocal cords are here. It has muscles and a lot of cartilage bound by elastic tissue. There are 3 large sections of cartilage. The largest one is called the thyroid cartilage. And this view is from the superior view. So you're looking at the throat head on. And this is the thyroid cartilage. It looks kind of like a shield. Below it is the cricoid cartilage, right below it. And then on the posterior side, more likely, but you can see it here in the anterior view, is the epiglottic or epiglottis. From the back side, here is the epiglottis. Notice how the thyroid does not go all the way around. It's mostly anterior. It ends on the sides here. But cricoid does go around. Here it is smaller in the front and then bigger in the back. There are some smaller cartilages. You don't need to know these three. Just know the large ones. So here they are. Thyroid, cricoid, epiglottic, or epiglottis, if you want to just name it that, that's fine. There's the epiglottis on our cadaver, and the vocal cords are right below it. These horizontal folds are composed of muscle and connective tissue, and that's what makes your vocal cords. Just know them as vocal cords. You don't need to know the difference between false and true, or the glottis, which is basically the hole. Just know that this area is the the vocal cords. The trachea, remember, is more rigid. Our esophagus is right behind it, recall. So the trachea is much more rigid. It enters the thoracic cavity and then splits into a left and right primary bronchi. It branches like a tree. If you turn this upside down, it would look like a tree. The trachea is lined with ciliated mucous membrane with goblet cells, and the rings that give it its rigidity are C-shaped. They're not complete circles of cartilage. They're C-shaped. They're open, in a sense, on the posterior side to rely for some flexibility and some room for your esophagus as well. They're made of hyaline cartilage, and their purpose is to prevent collapse of the trachea. Here is what they look like. And then our bronchi as they branch. A cross-section of your trachea will show that C shape of hyaline cartilage, and as well as the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. If you had a tracheostomy, it's a procedure that cuts an opening in the trachea and to insert a tube for air exchange. This is done only in emergency process if there is something lodged in the trachea above it to prevent air to get in to the lungs. The bronchial tree consists of the branched airways leading from the trachea to the microscopic air sacs in the lungs. The first branch is the primary off of the trachea, and then as it branches off of there, we go to secondary, tertiary, and then we go into bronchioles, and then finally down into alveoli, which are these like bundles of tiny little air sacs. This is a cool picture showing us the bronchial tree. It starts at the trachea and then goes down into primary, secondary, tertiary, and then you have other bronchioles, which you don't need to know the names of them, just know there's bronchioles. It's getting smaller and smaller, branching off. And then finally we get to the alveolar ducts, alveolus sac, and the alveola itself. And here is that breakdown. Here's the bronchial, here's the alveolus, and the alveolar duct here to the sac, and then here is our individual alveoli. These are super, super thin. Look at this microscopic picture. They're just tiny, like just one cell strong, one cell big. All these structures of the bronchial tree down to the terminal bronchioles are a conductive pathway. Since they transport air, they do not take part in the gas exchange. They're just moving the air. The structures between the respiratory bronchioles and the alveoli are part of the respiratory pathway since they contain alveoli and perform gas exchange. So at the very end is where you're doing your gas exchange. And if you look here, look at all the blood vessels wrapped around each of these alveoli. And you can see you've got capillary structures over here. These are like one cell wall thick. And that way we have the capillaries over there to exchange gases. Again, very small cell walls. The structure of the main bronchi is similar to the trachea, but they have cartilaginous plates instead of rings. And as the bronchi continue to branch, they become narrower, and thus the amount of cartilage decreases. So cartilage disappears in the bronchioles. Smooth muscle becomes more prominent then to help begin to diminish, and it diminishes from the bronchioles to the alveolar ducts where it disappears. The respiratory tube becomes thinner and thinner, and the type of epithelial changes. We go from pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium in the larger tubes to simple cuboidal epithelium in the respiratory bronchioles, then down to simple squamous epithelium in the alveoli. So here's a picture of our alveoli. We have branches, or these little sacs of cells. In here, they provide a surface area for that gas exchange. During the gas exchange, oxygen will diffuse through the alveolar wall to enter the blood. Then carbon dioxide will diffuse from the blood to the alveoli. The lungs are soft, spongy, cone-shaped organs in the thoracic cavity. The lungs are separated from each other by the heart and the mediastinum. The right side has 3 lobes, the left side has 2. And this is due to the heart being more to the left. Remember our pulmonary circulation. This should be a review for you. It's coming up from the right ventricle to the pulmonary trunk, to the pulmonary arteries, out to the lung, and then back by way of the pulmonary veins to the left atrium. On the lungs itself, we have what's called a hilum, which is a region on the medial surface of each lung where bronchi and blood vessels enter. It's all wrapped in a tissue as well called the viscera pleura, which is an inner layer of serous membrane attached to the surface of the lung. Then there's another layer called parietal pleura, which is a serous membrane lining the thoracic cavity. The pleural cavity itself is the space between that viscera and parietal pleura. Here is another drawing of it. Now, they're showing this cavity quite large. It's not really that big, but this is just to represent that there is a cavity between the viscera and parietal pleura. And this is what it looks like. So over time, your respiratory tract, ciliated epithelium become fewer in number, so the cilia become less active, the mucus starts to thicken. Sometimes as they get older, people will start to swallow and gag and cough. Those reflexes slow down, so there could be potential for inspiring fluid. Macrophages in the lung there's macrophages in the lung, and they will lose their efficiency. So you're a little more susceptible to respiratory infections at an older age. Breathing may become more of an effort because some of that costocartilage, which is between your rib bones and your sternum, starts to stiffen, and your postural changes can affect your thoracic cavity as well. So that's a good reason to have good posture and get adjusted so your lungs work better. Connective tissue replaces muscles in the bronchioles, which will hinder its dilation, and the bronchial walls thin and do not open as much. Your alveolar walls thin and the alveoli merge, which will decrease your gas exchange area as well. So as you noticed, we did not go over the parts of the chapter that talk about the molecular physics and process of respiratory or respiration. That those details are for ANP2, the physiology of this system. So you should know the structures that we talked about